I'm Isaac Daver. Welcome to Off Message. Today's guest, Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse. He's also the author of The Vanishing American Adult, a new book that just came out. The subtitle is Our Coming of Age Crisis and How to Rebuild a Culture of Self-Reliance. After college, before I got into journalism, got a master's degree at the University of Chicago. It was not in journalism. In fact, as maybe you can tell from my work, never took a journalism class in my life. I studied American intellectual history. I wrote a master's thesis about Henry David Thoreau and Ben Franklin and their autobiographies and their different concepts of what it meant to be an American. It had almost nothing to do with politics or with journalism, except for this. One of the speakers at the graduate student-wide orientation was a state senator who taught on the law school faculty named Barack Obama as the fall of 2002. So he had just lost the congressional race 2 years before. Nobody really cared who he was, and did not really think much of the fact that he was talking to us. I do remember that speech. It was a decent speech. I, at one point, when Obama was already president, said to him that he had spoken to us, and he was really confused by this. Basically, I've talked to a couple of people who work closely with him since, and anything that happened before that Democratic convention speech in 2004, when he became a superstar, is just like a different planet to him. But he wanted to know what he talked about, and I told him that he talked about the bookstores on 57th Street and which restaurants to go to, and he wanted to know whether he did a good job. And the only other connection between that master's program and my life now, I guess, is that, and I did not realize this until just a couple of weeks ago, Richard Spencer, now famous for being the founder of the alt-right and neo-Nazism in its modern form, was a classmate of mine. And we actually remember having a beer with him. We did not hit off a friendship. I was not all that impressed with him then, and I think it's fair to say that I'm less impressed with him now, although he was not into his neo-Nazism in those days. But aside from that, graduate school experience is pretty far from what I do day to day. This book from Ben Sasse kind of brought me back to those days. It is not a book that you would be likely to read when you're going into a bookstore and thinking that you're going to read a politician's book. Let me read one bit from it to just give you a sense of where he is. This is what it comes down to. He writes, "We are not ready. Our kids are not ready for the world they are soon going to inherit." So he is pretty freaked out about America, what is going on with our culture, and what is going on with the consumer culture overall. So I asked him whether that leads to him thinking that President Donald Trump is an adult by his standards. And he ducked that question really hard at first. He came back to it later when I made him come back to it. But you could see the struggle that he's going through in having written this book, which he said he conceived of years ago, before he was even in the Senate, was working on, had an agent for before Trump was the Republican nominee, and he started becoming well known for being a very rabid anti-Trump person, never Trump person. He would so clearly have been pushing this book and promoting it if Trump were not president and not having to answer questions like these. I'm going to start with a conversation with Eliana Johnson coming back to us. She's national political reporter here at Politico and knows what is going on within the Republican Party better than most. And I think her thoughts on how Sasse fits into what's going on are really instructive, and thinking about what his future would be potentially and how he'll fit into what's coming. Remember to subscribe and rate us on iTunes or whatever your favorite podcast platform is. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook at Isaac Daver, and email me with your thoughts and suggestions at Isaac, ISAAC, at Politico.com. We have a really interesting lineup of guests coming up, including Wyclef Jean, Linda McMahon, Terry McAuliffe, you're going to want to be listening to those, but I also want to know who else you'll want to be listening to. So let me know, and we will get those thoughts into our heads as we're figuring out the weeks and months ahead. And now, our conversation with Eliana Johnson. So, Greg Gianforte is now headed to Congress.
Rep-elect
Greg Gianforte. He won about 28 hours after he body slammed a reporter. A lot of those votes were counted or were in before any of that happened because of the mail votes. Do you think we're going to see more of this kind of behavior, politicians attacking reporters? Ben Sasse says in the interview that your job as if you want to be in Congress.
Spoiler alert, guys.
Yeah, spoiler alert. It's a teaser, really. If you want to be in politics, your job is to teach civics, and teaching civics means respecting the First Amendment. It says if you know anything about the First Amendment, you know not to body slam a reporter. But is this where we're headed? It's not the first incident like this.
You know, I was maybe alone among reporters in saying I didn't think it mattered so much that the subject of Gianforte's ire was a reporter. I thought his behavior was terrible and that it demonstrated he was temperamentally unsuited to serve in Congress. And
right, it's not.
I don't actually think that there's going to be a trend of violence toward reporters among elected representatives or others. I think there was a trend of during Trump rallies he penned up reporters and he directed people's anger toward them, and we saw the potential for sort of mass hysteria. But no, I don't think we're going to see more of this sort of thing. I think this was an isolated incident of somebody who's temperamentally unsuited to be a public representative. What I do think is commendable, and Ben Sasse continued a trend of sort of standing alone among Republicans and saying that he didn't approve of the behavior. And
it's just like it's unacceptable no matter how it goes.
And I didn't understand really what would have been so hard for Paul Ryan to say. Paul Ryan came out and said that the people of Montana will make their choice. And I didn't understand what would have been so hard about saying people of Montana will make their choice if they choose Gianforte. It's not House Republicans will not look forward to welcoming him as a colleague or, just wait until I assign him to wait till he sees his committee assignments, which is something Chuck Todd said yesterday, or something like that. It's tough for me to see why Republicans seem to be walking on eggshells around this situation.
And it does seem like another instance of the sort of teamism that's going on here. He was a Republican candidate, and so Republican leaders didn't want to say anything. You saw the day Mike Pence had gone and campaigned for him, and then the day of the election, which was that period in between, the incident only happened the night before the election. Pence ducked reporters entirely, and then the morning after Gianforte wins, sends out a tweet congratulating him. Everybody is sort of there. But the thing that struck me is that then you saw Democrats who were saying, well, don't say this is both sides, politicians attacking reporters. Look, there have been more incidents of Republicans being in things like this, but I'm going to speak personally here. Last summer at the Democratic Convention, I had an incident with Alan Grayson, who was a Democratic congressman who started sort of pushing me out of the way. It does seem like, maybe to your point, not about politicians towards reporters, but like human beings towards each other, right? Like we think that.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's part of the increasing polarization, lack of manners, and civic virtue, as Ben Sasse might put it.
Hey, now you're just plugging his book for him. What does this aside from that incident, the results of the special election, which he won by a pretty wide margin, Gianforte, again, most of those votes probably were in by mail before any of this happened. What does it tell you about the environment overall politically at this moment? I was tweeting the day of the election about what it might mean if Gianforte won and the consequences of it one way or that way or the other. And I got so many sensitive emails from Democratic and Republican operatives who were like, you don't understand. It doesn't mean what you think it does. So what does it mean?
I think it demonstrates that partisanship is an extraordinarily powerful force right now. That being said, it's not like the Democrats ran an extraordinarily strong candidate or campaign. I think that needs to be said. The Democrats ran a weak enough candidate such that Republican voters, even faced with a candidate who threw a reporter to the ground, still cast ballots for him. And I don't even think a majority of them had cast early votes. This still could have gone the other way. And this was a candidate Republicans knew was going to win by a smaller margin than most Republicans win in Montana, that he was a weak candidate, and Democrats still couldn't manage to defeat him. So the Democrats didn't field a very strong candidate, but partisanship is an extraordinarily strong force. One data point that's caught my attention in recent months is that in the 1950s, say, the people were asked, how would you feel about your child marrying somebody of a different political party than you? And the number of people who cared were in the teens. The percentage was in the teens. That number has increased by a wide margin now. It's, 20-some% of Republicans say they care, and 20-some% of Democrats say they care. So the number of people who say they don't care has shrunk dramatically.
And that's just the people who are admitting it.
Right. It was about, say it was 70% of people who didn't care. I'm sure I'm getting these numbers wrong, but say it was 72% of people who didn't care in the 1950s. That number has shrunk to about 45% now. Yeah. And I think that's a demonstration of how partisanship is seeping into personal relationships in a way that isn't totally constructive.
And it seems like Quist, the Democratic candidate, a lot of the Democrats, this is great. We have a banjo player. He's so Montana. The search for the candidate who's not like the typical politician, but maybe this is a case of searching a little too hard for that, right? Because, as you say, Gianforte, by the way, ran for governor just last year, lost. Was a flawed candidate. Republicans were not happy with him long before he attacked that reporter. But he is more of a candidate, a politician candidate, right?
Well, I was going to say somebody who throws a reporter to the ground is not a typical politician, right. But somebody clearly more in the Donald Trump mode than you might normally get.
Do you think that this tells us anything, it informs in any way where the mood is about the larger political calculations going on, as people do already start to make predictions about what's going to happen in the midterms next year?
I think not totally. I think we need to be careful about extrapolating out from strange and somewhat isolated events. But it is interesting to me that Democrats haven't really invested in these special elections in 2017, which do in a way set the table for the 2018 races in terms of enthusiasm and excitement. I know from Republicans that they do not see Trump as a positive going into 2018. Though he has not seemed to be a drag in these 2017 races. So in that sense, I don't think that these special elections are necessarily predictive of what the 2018 environment is going to be like.
That Georgia one might be, right? People may read a little more there, right?
A little bit more, but I still think that, Republicans are extraordinarily worried that not that the Russia investigation is going to have an enormous effect on 2018, but that come 2018, Democratic candidates are going to be able to campaign and say, what has this administration accomplished?
I'm curious where you think Ben Sasse fits into all this. When I asked him, again, here's another teaser. At the end of the interview, we did a little word association game, and I asked him what the words Republican Party bring to mind for him, and he said, question mark. What is he is this a guy who had never been in elected office before he was elected to the Senate, sees himself as really an outsider still. There's a lot of speculation that he could do anything from run for president in 2020 to not run for re-election in 2020 when he's up and just do one term. Where does he fit into what's going on in the Republican Party?
I think Ben Sasse is absolutely right when he gives you a question mark when you ask him about the Republican Party. It's a puzzle to me, whether the Republican Party still exists in any meaningful way and whether the conservative movement still exists in any meaningful way. I think the Republican Party exists insofar as candidates run with an R next to their name. What that means, I'm not sure anymore, and I think that's likely what Senator Sasse meant when he responded with a question mark. Not only have the parties, the power of the parties weakened. If the parties had power, Donald Trump would not have been the Republican nominee and he wouldn't be president now. But what it means to be associated with any political party in terms of the content of a politician's views has become murkier and murkier, particularly with Trump's ascendance. But Ben Sasse, he was in terms of elected officials, perhaps the most vocal anti-Trump Republican. That being said, I think that won him a lot of respect and adulation, not among voters in Nebraska. He's taken political hits back home in his home state, but it's won him a tremendous amount of respect and adulation among elites. There is no Ben Sasse groundswell, among grassroots voters in the country in the way that there is a Trump groundswell. Which suggests to me, I don't know that there would be a lot of enthusiasm among voters in a Ben Sasse for president campaign, though he has garnered a tremendous amount of respect among elites in New York, Washington, D.C., California, San Francisco. I see him as either somebody who stays in the Senate or somebody who will run a think tank or exert influence in a different way, not as a leader who garners an enormous amount of influence by igniting grassroots voters.
What do his colleagues think of him?
I think he's a puzzle to many of them because he's congenial, but not somebody who plays the typical, he's not working the phones like LBJ.
No, but he's a warm guy. He just doesn't seem to care that much about the political process and the backslapping and all that. He's sort of having fun with some of the people. He had those tweets that he did.
Fun, not a word one typically associates with lawmakers. In Washington.
And look, he's in his early 40s. He's going
to have an impact, and I think people are not quite sure in what way he's going to make that impact right now.
All right, Eliana Johnson, thanks for helping us sort some of this out. And now let's go to that interview with Ben Sasse. So the book is about adolescence versus self-reliance in the larger sense, not just about kids and individuals, but about the country. There's a moment in the book where you say training wheels are made to come off. What does that mean?
Yeah, so, first of all, let's be clear that adolescence itself is a gift, right? A concept's only 2 millennia old, really, that we believe that when you become biologically an adult, you hit puberty. That doesn't mean you have to immediately be fully financially, morally, emotionally, household structure, school leaving age-wise, fully an independent adult yet. It's a pretty special gift, but only if you get that adolescence is a means to an end. Right? If adolescence becomes a destination, then you got a problem because training wheels are made to come off. And Neverland was a hell. Peter Pan is a dystopia. Disney has remade it, and a bunch of kids grow up thinking Peter Pan is a utopia. But he becomes an adult. He's killing people, and he has no moral sense or historical memory. He doesn't even remember the names of the people he kills. And I think right now we have too many kids stranded in adolescence, and so we've drifted toward this concept of perpetual adolescence, which I don't think is a good thing, and I think we should debate it.
This is a question that I've never asked a senator before. Who is more evil in your mind, Peter Pan or John Dewey?
Oh, that's a good one. I want to make up some joke that makes John Dewey the inspiration for Peter Pan, but the joke probably won't work. But I would love to send John Dewey to Neverland.
These are your general principles for what it means to be an adult. Overcome peer culture. You mean spend time with people who are not like you, not the same age as you, and that's a big point of the book, but also different beliefs. Work hard. Resist consumption, which is limiting your time, whether it's on TV or watching TV or whatever else, and focusing on production. Like the example you give of your daughters, not letting them watch TV and making them play music. And then travel to see different cultures, but also to understand the difference between needing something and wanting something.
Becoming literate.
Right, becoming literate. Is President Trump an adult by your definition?
So I won't resist you the whole time, but I must resist at the beginning and reaffirm that this book is truly 100% not a political book.
No,
And
it's not about an attack on President Trump, but I think that there is this a lot of people look at any president as representing the culture and saying something about the culture, and certainly sending a message to people about what the culture is at this moment. And that is one of the things that people have reflected on with President Trump as president, what it tells people about what our values are. They do seem, and this is not, are you going to run against him or anything like that? The values that you're upholding seem different from the values that he stands by.
Yeah, I think he and I obviously have a very different view of the world. I think that public service is a temporary calling. So in a sense, he being an outsider, we have some alignment here. But I think it's a temporary calling that has a servant posture. I think as a public servant, you're supposed to believe in servant leadership, where politics exists to maintain a framework for ordered liberty, where life is lived, frankly, outside the spotlight. Life is lived where people work and worship, and where they raise their kids, and where they join the Rotary Club, and where they love their neighbor and serve in their community in a meaningful way, or maybe where they labor and design the new app that is going to change the digital economy. And so I think most of what's interesting in life is surely not connected to glamour or fame or the centers of power. And obviously, the president has had kind of 3 careers en route to becoming president. Think of them as 3 10 to 15-year careers. He had a real estate business where he was really successful. He sort of took his dad's model of the outer boroughs and brought a new real estate model to Manhattan, and he was successful doing that from the mid-'70s till 1990. Then he had a bunch of operating companies for 10 or 15 years, I guess, casinos and operating companies. Most of those failed. And then he had the career that really launched him into the presidency, which is celebrity reality TV. And let's be clear, the guy's a marketing genius. He recognized far before Politico and other media outlets recognized you're going to have a disintermediation of media channels. The barriers to entry were going down. There would be far more entrants. There would be the potential of a lot more siloing and echo chambers in the way that we do media. And frankly, if you can be a content provider on a grand scale, you become kind of more significant than the mediating distribution channels. And he had an intuition about that and how you run media cycles, which is heavily driven by provocation and kind of outlandish statement. And you can kind of overpromise, and whatever happens next, there'll probably be a new moment in the 24/7 media cycle. So, I mean, he definitely comes from a world to the presidency that comes out of a reality TV world. And I have lots of anxiety about whether or not that kind of world is really what we want for our kids. I think that the distinction between childhood and adulthood, which are both really important things, right? Little kids actually are vulnerable and need to be protected. They really are dependent on others for providing their food and their shelter. But adults, when you become a fully formed American adult, you want to believe in Republican virtue, small r Republican, not partisan Republican Party. We believe in Republican virtue, where the American people need to believe in self-restraint, self-discipline, self-control, self-governance. The reason we have the political system we have, with separation of powers and with decentralization, with our federalist system, is fundamentally because we believe the most interesting places in the world aren't Washington, D.C. And I know you grew up in New York, so New York is also a place where people actually live and work and raise their kids. But the sort of New York, the euphemism, is New York, the media and the financial capital of the world. And all Americans are supposed to think that there's not some distant power center, the 1% financially in New York or the 1% politically powerful in D.C., and that everybody else is somehow off in the 99%. Americans are supposed to believe, in a Tocquevillian sense, that the center of the world is where they live and work and raise their kids. And we need 320 million people to all think they live in the center of the world in their local neighborhood.
But I'm going to linger on President Trump for a moment here. He very famously watches a lot of TV, does a lot of consuming, and he very famously doesn't read very much. He likes bullet points, one-page memos. We see he's in the middle of this foreign trip, and there was a recognition among foreign leaders that they needed to speak to him in much shorter presentations and cater to their sense of his personality. It does not seem like that's the same kind of ideal that you're holding up for what we should all strive for.
I think that Gutenberg is, in a very real sense, the father of America. The chapter in The Vanishing American Adult about literacy and about building a personal library is partly a historical argument. Obviously, the original sin of American slavery and of racism in our history was something that we needed Lincoln to MLK to lead us out of. So the American project wasn't complete at the Declaration and the founding, but the American project that was launched at the Declaration and the founding was very clearly enabled by the fact that you had unbelievable mass literacy. New England in the 1750s is arguably, according to a lot of cultural and social historians, is arguably the most literate culture in the history of the world. Just the way, the dispassionate disciplines of how you read and what a print culture can produce, that's a prerequisite for America. And I do think there's a risk in our media-driven and particularly digital media-driven culture, TV-based, broadcast-based, and image-based culture of this digital moment. There is a danger that we create shorter and shorter attention spans, more and more unbridled passions, less and less self-control and self-restraint. And I don't think that our founders would believe that America could long prosper if the people were not readers. We now have a culture where the average American reads 19 minutes a day, and it's declining rapidly. Young people read much, much less than that. That's a warning bell.
I'm not going to ask you about Donald Trump this entire time. You started writing this book a long time ago, and certainly the ideas came a long time ago. It was, I assume, pretty far down the road before you knew even that he was going to be the nominee. So this is not about you versus Donald Trump. You talk about the subtitle of the book is America's Coming of Age Crisis. It's a national existential crisis. It's a suggestion. It's sort of a diagnosis of what's wrong and a suggestions of some ways to combat it.
Correct.
How optimistic are you that what you're talking about can actually come together here? This is there's a lot in this book about differences that individual parents need to have in what they're doing, and as a society, as a government, how we approach a lot of things.
Yeah, we got a lot of work in front of us. I believe in human potential. I believe in the dignity of 320 million Americans, actually 7 billion people across the globe. And so I am optimistic.
But this is an American problem, right?
Well, it's a first world problem, but it's an especially American problem because we believe unique things about the potential of local communities to show self-restraint and to solve problems. And in a broken world, which is the world we always live in, right, there are people who want to take your life and your liberty and your stuff. And so people need security. People want security. People feel anxiety. They want comfort. And the best way to exercise governance, restraint, control, order, stability in the world is for that to come from inside the well springs of virtue in individual Americans. If that declines, there will be more yearning for more power in the world, for more substitution of other-centric control. There is a yearning in America that you can see little bits of buds of people who say, somebody say you're going to be my daddy and be the strong man from the center. That is an attack on the American idea, but it is a natural thing for people to yearn from when they feel anxiety and worry. So I think we have to be clear that we live at a moment in economic history where anxiety is at a real high pitch, and we have some historical analogs. Why I talk a lot about Teddy Roosevelt in this book is because there was a time in de-agriculturalization and industrialization industrialization. I say it that way on purpose because right now we think of ourselves as living in a post-industrial moment, but we don't really know the constructive word to use for the mobile, digital, portable economy of the future, the sort of multi-career life, which is what's really coming. People are going to be disintermediated out of jobs at 40 and 45 and 50 and need to get a new job. That's new in human history. I believe human capital and social capital and dense social networks will recreate neighborliness, but we don't know what that's going to look like right now. And we've got some historical analogs. People thought it was the end of the world in the late 1880s, 90s, 1900s, and teens when the economy was transitioning from an ag-centric rural village culture to urban industrialization. It turned out urban ethnic neighborhoods recreated a lot of social capital. We don't know what comes next. We need to have those kinds of discussions, which are much bigger than the political fights we have right now.
How much, though, is Washington the source of the problem, or is it a symptom of the problem? What's going on in Washington?
Washington is just lame. Washington is incredibly ineffective. Washington is
You mean lame, not in the sort of slang way. You mean like actually
right.
lame.
I mean, Washington is weak, and Washington is run by a whole bunch of people who think that they're just, one budget cycle away from fixing the really big problems in American life, and they're wondering who among them will rise up to lead. Washington is populated by people who aren't very interesting. Washington isn't the source of these problems. Washington is right now a symptomatic echo of many of these problems. But I think we should just start by admitting that the two political parties are intellectually exhausted. They don't have future-oriented ideas right now. I'm the third or fourth most conservative guy in the Senate by voting record. So if you want to do a continuum of how do you vote on the policy fights that we're actually voting on today, then I'm a Republican at the conservative end of the Republican Party. But I think two things bigger than that. One, even at the policy level, we're not debating the big important things. We're not voting on the things that actually matter right now. We're stuck in mostly, retro fights that sometimes go all the way back to the 1960s, but often are just the budget fights of 4 and 6 and 8 and 10 years ago. That's lame. But then even above the policies we should be debating, we have to understand that America is an idea before it's a policy fight. And there should be things
that's one
that
of
we
your
agree
chapters,
in
Make
common.
America an Idea Again, right?
Amen.
That one, I assume, was that title chapter at least inspired by Donald Trump.
The president is never named in the book, but that one chapter title is definitely inspired by the president. It is America from Tocqueville to Thatcher to Bono that understands that America is an idea. I remember being at a dinner a number of months ago. Bill Gates and David Petraeus and Bono and I end up at a dinner at a security conference. It feels like a bad joke that is, a rabbi and a Nebraska farm kid walk into a bar. Yeah, I mean, Joshua Tree was like, when you're 8 or 10 in Nebraska, I guess it's the 30th anniversary, so I could do the math on my age right now. So I must have been 14 or something when it came out. But Bono said to me one time, he said, the thing
it's a great way to live, where you can say Bono said to me one time.
Well, because this is not a Republican idea. And I'm talking about American exceptionalism here. Democrats sometimes bizarrely act like American exceptionalism is something they're not supposed to celebrate. President Obama bizarrely ran away from the phrase a couple of times. You remember when he was asked, do you believe in American exceptionalism? I think this was early in the 2012 cycle. And you could just see his brain calculating. And President Obama knew that he was supposed to say yes, but he felt kind of guilty saying yes. So he offers this weird, mealy-mouthed answer. Yeah, sure, I believe in American exceptionalism the way that Greeks probably believe in Greek exceptionalism and Brits believe in British exceptionalism. Except that's not what American exceptionalism means. American exceptionalism is not an ethnic claim. American exceptionalism is not some sort of arrogant claim that Americans think we're better than other people. American exceptionalism is a historical understanding of how unique Philadelphia in 1787 was, because our founders flipped on its head the idea that government gives us rights. We believe this glorious thing that leads to free press, free speech, free assembly, freedom of religion, which is that people are endowed with dignity by nature, and government is our shared project to secure those rights. Government isn't the author or source of our rights. We believe in universal human dignity. Now is when you get to the policy fight about what level of foreign interventionism should we have when we see human dignity not being advanced around the globe. And that's an important policy debate, but that flows from a prior anthropological belief about human dignity. And the American founding was historically unique. It obviously came out of an English tradition going all all the way back to the Magna Carta. But the idea that America believes in human dignity and that we get a theory of government that's limited that derives from that, that is something that Tocqueville clearly understood when he travels America in the 1830s and 40s.
Tocqueville, you point out, says America doesn't have adolescence, right? And that's your whole point of the book.
Yeah, well, so I'll quibble just a tiny bit because it does have adolescence in the sense that we don't force our kids to go leave the house immediately when they hit puberty. But clearly America, and Tocqueville saw this, did believe in the potential of kids as little workers. And some of that's just the moment in economic history, right? Hunter-gatherers and agrarianism, you don't have job choice by and large. You have becoming 8 or 10 or 12 or 14, and you add more value to earn your keep around your household, and you may be apprenticed out to go and learn a trade. And so you may go live with an aunt and uncle 20 miles away, which was, across the globe in 1800, 1810, 1820. And so a huge part of what I want to wrestle with in this book is that experience of cross-cultural travel to another neighborhood, not the grand European tour for rich people, but going to another neighborhood and seeing a different way of ordering life, of developing a work ethic, all of that sense that America has about human dignity. That's what Bono means when he says, I love Ireland. Ireland is a beautiful place. Ireland has a glorious people. But Ireland is not an idea. It's a place with a history. America is an idea. We're a creedal nation. There are certain things that you believe when you're an American, and we're not doing a good job of teaching that to the next generation. And if we're going to pass along a republic of virtue, a place that actually has limited government, not a future drift toward soft authoritarianism, we need to teach the next generation that America is an idea.
I want to bring you back to the question of Washington and what Washington has done. People in Washington have approached some of these things. A lot of what you write about, and you were talking about it, is the way the economy has changed and is not changing back, right? People's jobs are gone. This you just pointed out a place where you disagree with Obama. It seems like on this point you sort of agree with him because he would often say those jobs aren't coming back, and that got him into some trouble. Have people in politics done a disservice by continuing to say, well, we're going to get those factories open again, we're going to get those jobs back in that sort of way, and not addressing this massive change that is clearly going on in the country?
Yes. Quit lying to the voters. Tell the truth about where we are in economic history and admit that technology and ultimately automation that goes all the way to machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to accelerate economic change in the world. It is indisputably true that the pace of economic change is going to continue to accelerate. The high water mark of American industrial employment was in the mid-1950s, and we got to between 30 and 31% of American workers working in what I think of as big tool economy jobs, industrial jobs. Today, it's about 7.5% of the American workforce that works in big tool industrial jobs, and yet we have more total industrial output in the U.S. now than we did in the mid-1950s. That's a fact that adults need to pause and linger on, and that politicians who pander by saying we're going to bring back all these industrial jobs, we have more output than we had 60 years ago. And yet we have 1/4 as many American workers working in that space. That's because of technology. That's not primarily because of trade. Now, we could have a big and important conversation about trade. I'm a zealous free trader. I think consumers win on both sides of a voluntary trading relationship. Producers win on net on both sides of a border in voluntary trading relationships. And yet subsectors of production go through disruption when there's more free trade agreement and a reduction of protectionist tariffs. And we should talk about trade mitigation policies that might actually work as opposed to the clunky, crappy ones we have now. We should talk about job retraining.
Are you a big fan of multilateral trade agreements?
I'm for all that you can do to reduce trade barriers, and usually multilateral agreements are going to be much more effective. Just the sort of basic
So like you would have voted potentially for the TPP if it had come to the Senate.
I wanted TPP to be good, and I wanted to not just vote for it but go out and celebrate it. But I need to know what was in the final agreement, and we never got to vote on it because we never got to the final agreement. Any really complicated multilateral deal like that, especially one negotiated under a trade promotion authority provision, will end up having a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah.
You'll agree with some of them. In my case, I think I'd agree with many of them, and you'll disagree with some of them. I need to know which are the ones I would disagree with and how bad do I think those were. You do need to have good trade deals negotiated, but the first line question should be, do we want more trade with Asia? And the answer is yes. Where I'm from, producers and consumers both win immediately ultimately when there's more trade with Asia. We get more export markets for our commodity crops, but we also get more export markets primarily for beef. Nebraska is the largest cattle state in the union. Japan consumes a lot of beef, and we have a 40% tariff on Nebraska beef going to Japan. I want that reduced. I also want Nebraskans to get cheaper pickup trucks. The two best-selling vehicles in America by far are the Ford F-150 and the Chevy Silverado. In Nebraska, they're off the charts, the number 1 and 2 vehicles. And if we had more trade with Japan, you may not, as a Nebraska farmer or rancher, ultimately decide to buy a Japanese pickup. But I guarantee you, your F-150 and your Silverado are going to become higher quality, lower cost if there's more competition from those Japanese trucks. So I think Americans can compete with the world, and I'd like us to demonstrate it by getting governments out of the way of telling people they can't transact.
A lot of there are a bunch of moments in the book where you talk about if people from the 1600s were to come walk through our society today, what they'd think of it. You end with a graduation speech by Teddy Roosevelt that you wrote. What would Teddy Roosevelt think about America today?
Yeah, so The Vanishing American Adult, as you flagged, is 2/3 constructive. It's 1/3 stage setting, and it's 2/3 what's the habit formation that we should be attending to help our 13-year-olds become 15, 17, and 19, be able to tell those ages and those moments and markers apart. I think that if Teddy Roosevelt were here today, he would see some analogs to the moment he lived in, where you went through an industrialization moment where there was panic, that America's historic, again, small r Republican culture of the village, the Tocquevillian village, the New England village, the Mid-Atlantic, you would ultimately not be able to reproduce accountability, transparency, self-control in cities because they were too anonymous. Human capital won't form in the same way. There won't be neighborliness in the cities. Happily, they were wrong. And by they, I mean Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, Democrats like Woodrow Wilson, who thought we needed a new theory of expert governance because the people weren't going to be smart enough to control themselves and regulate their own behaviors in local communities. They were wrong. And what ended up happening was urban ethnic neighborhoods recreated a lot of that social capital that you had known in the old agrarian village. I think if Teddy were here today, he would recognize that that's the moment, that's the kind of moment, the disruption that we're going through. And we don't know what comes next. We don't have a term for the next thing. Again, industrialization is what we call the old era. We don't refer to it as de-agriculturalization because they knew where they ultimately ended up, and now that's the historical lens we apply. Because we don't know where we're going yet today, there's heightened anxiety. But I think the thing that Teddy would be really anxious about is that we don't talk about what we want as a coming-of-age set of character traits that are going to be identifiable in our kids. And that's what The Vanishing American Adult is really trying to do, is tap into what I think is a burgeoning discussion among lots of parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and neighbors across the country that says most of life is not about politics. Most of life is about what you're passing on to the next generation that is by voluntarism and persuasion and entrepreneurship and love, not compulsion and power. And yet we don't have a venue to discuss those things. I think we're hollowing out local community. Mediating institutions and families are being disrupted, not just by the economy itself, but on the overlay of social capital that comes with the economic disruption of traditional urban neighborhoods. But we're failing to take that next step of saying, well, wait a minute, what are we trying to build together? Because nationally, our conversations are increasingly partisan political, even though what people really want is shared and meaningful and public, but public square that often starts at the level of debate and persuasion, not gets right to the level of what's the one policy solution.
And Teddy Roosevelt he grew up as an asthmatic kid. He turned himself into a Rough Rider.
Yeah.
He had this sense that seems to align, obviously, a lot with what you are hoping for. You also do a couple of...
I'll interrupt you for just one second to say we have a third dog in our life, which is just a sign of failed parenting, obviously. My wife and I got worked by our kids. And I am a Teddy Roosevelt fan in the sense of he's a crazy uncle. There's a lot about his politics I would argue with, but I want every kid to have a Teddy Roosevelt in their life that comes over and finds them too addicted to their smartphone, sedentary, eyes tied down, immobile, and have them just bat them up the side of the head and say, going to the top of a mountain on your friend's Instagram is not the same as going to the top of a real mountain. Let's go. We're hiking. I don't care if it's 10:30 at night. We're going now. Get your backpack and let's roll. But evidently I've been channeling Teddy Roosevelt so much over the last year as I was writing this book in the early mornings and on the weekends that my kids on their own decided to name this third dog Teddy Roosevelt.
What kind of dog is that?
I don't want to go there. It's embarrassing. It's
Come on.
It's one of those hybrid things that I don't know. It sounds too yuppie to have bought at a ranch. It's some sort of a breed that has
it a big dog?
a lot of lab in it.
I grew up with a long-haired Dachshund. It's bigger than that. I assume it's not a ranch in Nebraska.
I think I'm going to keep ducking this, but I think it's some sort of a Labradoodle.
Why won't you answer the question?
Labradoodle-ish. What have I done? We're done here. This interview is over. Can I body slam you?
I have myself been attacked by by a sitting member of Congress, but not quite as extensively as what Greg Gianforte did. Ben Franklin is another person you talk about a bunch. On the one hand, I feel like you could say that he would be aghast at a lot of things that are in culture, but that's based on how he liked to present himself in reality. And I mentioned to you before we started, I got a master's degree, and one of the things that I wrote about was Franklin essentially faking his autobiography. He was a total hedonist. In some ways, I feel like he'd love America today. He could just do whatever he wanted and be the guy that he really was.
There's a lot that if Ben Franklin were your next door neighbor, a little bit Teddy Rooseveltish, that you'd love that your kids would have this crazy uncle in their life, and yet you would want to debate
except for like the sex parties,
fundamental
right?
moral questions about self-restraint and self-control for the guy. But I think one of the things that his tidied up autobiography, excises that our history books don't do a good job of teaching our kids about is you have to understand Teddy Roosevelt as sort of a wheeler dealer, Ben Franklin, as a wheeler dealer in the marketplace of ideas that often got darn close to screaming extra, extra with some fake news. So he is a printer first and foremost. This is kind of a runaway teenage kid who got into the business of realizing that, as we talked earlier, Gutenberg is kind of the true father of America. And when you get to a place where there's a printing press and you have now a diversity of ideas and you have cultural pluralism and you decide that government is to protect that framework for ordered liberty where people can wrestle and can argue, well, then you get to free press. That's pretty great, but it also means you're going to have some quality. Amen. I mean, the First Amendment is the beating heart of the American experiment, but you get to a place where there's a free press, and there will often be a bunch of ideas that might be trying to lead with sizzle and salaciousness rather than substance and a lot of fact-checking and editing. And Ben Franklin got rich by publishing things like Every Man His Own Lawyer, Every Man His Own Doctor, functionally Every Man His Own Priest.
And this is part of what I wrote my master's thesis about, actually. It was he wanted to put forward this ideal of what an American was, even though he wasn't quite that guy, like the shopping lists and the very restrained way of doing everything. And meanwhile, he's stuffing his face all the time and chasing women and everything else, right? It was a do as I say, not as I do. And you, in contrast, I'm not going to put you up next to Ben Franklin, but your book is, this is what we're doing. We're trying our best. This is how it may apply to your life.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wearing a lot less skins and furs on my head than he did. And so he was obviously
flying fewer kites.
Yeah, that's pretty glorious, though, what he did there. But I do think that the American people want to have a conversation about what you want for your kids. And a huge part of that is, what do we want their character to look like? And that's one of the things that is odd to your point about generational segregation right now, is we are raising 17-year-olds.
Your point about generational segregation.
Well, you flagged it a little while ago. 17-year-olds that only live with other 17-year-olds are really going to feel, overly harmed by one particular pure slight, where if 60-year-olds and 75-year-olds and people who fought at Omaha Beach, all of a sudden a 17-year-old saying something mean and hurtful to me is probably not quite as big a deal if I have a little bit of wisdom that comes from having traveled across the generations by knowing other people. And I think right now the safe space movement is a good example of something we're doing to bubble wrap our kids that is well-intentioned, but is ultimately going to harm them. The reason you go to higher education is to encounter ideas you didn't already know and didn't already believe. And you're tough enough, you're resilient enough, you can handle this. And oh, by the way, I don't know why you're paying tuition if you're only going to hear things you already knew before you got there.
You were a president of a college, Midland College in Nebraska, or Midland University, I'm sorry, when you got inspired by this book. Have you been writing it since then, basically?
Yeah, the book came out of some experiences in 2012 at the college, and I resolved that I was going to write this, I don't know, Christmas of 12, and I think I got an agent spring of 13, and at that point I had no intentions of running for office. I'm one of 5 people in the Senate who'd never been a politician before. I went on a listening tour in the summer of 13 and started running in the fall of 13, then spent 16 months living off a campaign bus. So the book was ideas in 2012, got an agent in early 2013, then put it on hold when I went out to live on a campaign bus. And then I wrote it, kind of in early 2016, middle 2016, early mornings and weekends. But the ideas all come from my college president days.
Why did you run for Senate? With everything else that you're interested in, and as you say, you're not a politician, obviously. A lot of what you're dealing with day to day rubs against you in ways that you don't completely enjoy.
I believe in a one cheer for politics theory of the public square. 0 cheers for politics is insane. The world is broken and you need order, you need structure, you need protection, you need a national security strategy for the age of cyber and jihad, which we don't have yet. But I'm also pretty zealously dead set against a 3 cheers for politics view of the world, which actually thinks power is the center. I think love is the center. And you need protection so that you can court people and woo people and persuade and be persuaded and make music and read books. And so all the stuff that really matters in life, you can't move the human soul by power, but you need power to create that protected greenhouse where people can actually huddle around the dinner table and wrestle with big ideas at a restaurant or in the public square. I am in public office partly to displace other people from public office who believe in a 3 cheers for government view of the world. I really do think public service is important.
So you never, before 2013, you never thought about running for office before?
Like every teenage, overachieving nerd in America, I probably named every future job from some essay for some teacher somewhere. So I'm sure when I was, 10 or 12 or 14, I made some dumb prediction about doing political stuff. But my main touchstone of my future career orientation then and remains today that I'm going to be offensive coordinator for the Nebraska Cornhuskers someday.
Going to get a PhD in history is usually not a pathway toward politics unless you're Woodrow Wilson.
I was going to say that Bill Belichick might argue that a history PhD is the perfect pathway to the grit necessary to try to call offensive plays for a football team on some Saturday in the future.
There are 2 suspicions about your own political future that people have. Number one is that you will serve 1 term and then you'll be done. You'll be up in 2020. The other is that you might run for president, including in a primary against the incumbent president in 2020. What do you say to either of those?
I think the noxious weed control board of Dodge County, Nebraska is likely my political future. I have the 2 callings that I want right now. I get to serve the people in Nebraska, and I'm raising 3 kids on the road. I think I'm the only commuting dad in the U.S. Senate. My kids are 15, 13, and 6, and I bring somebody with me a lot of weeks. And my Twitter feed,
2 of your kids are being homeschooled.
They're all 3 of them are kind of hybrid schooled, so we do a broad range of stuff. Again, the Vanishing American Adult is 100% not politics. It's 99% not policy, but the 1% that is I think we're just completely asleep at the switch in policy circles about how much disruption is coming to education in the future. And so one example of this is these firm categories that you're 100% public school or you're Catholic, 100% Catholic school or you're 100% private school or you're 100% homeschool. I think what's coming in the future is going to be a lot more hybridized education. And that's really what we do with our kids. Our older 2, our teenage girls, they're about 1/4 time public high school students. And then they do some online stuff. My wife, who's a former public school teacher and administrator, she runs a lot of their curriculum. And so we take it on the road. But I think that the most important things we're doing as parents often benefit from the tool that is this school or that school, but it's just a tool. And the thing we want is character development and education. We want them to become real readers. We want them to be addicted to the habit of reading. We want them to have appetites to grow their bookshelf. We want them to want to work. We want them to be skeptical of their own digital addictions at different points. School is often an important tool in that, but I'm a dad on the road trying to raise my kids well. And if you see at Ben Sasse, my Twitter feed, there's very little of it that's about politics, but a lot of it is about American life. And that's a dad on the road.
Someone who likes your politics said to me the other day when I told we were going to do this interview, said his Twitter feed doesn't seem like it can be real.
Just because there's so many dead animals? Or
well,
why?
no, it's also and look, part of your book is about figuring out what we do with the digital culture and social media and everything. But you love Twitter.
I probably I love Twitter partly because of what I think is happening in the media. It's a way to explore it. I'm worried about the decline of editing. I think there are two different comments here. One, I'm worried about the decline of editing as you disintermediate functions like stock brokerage and travel agency and music publishing. A whole bunch of things happen when you take out the middlemen that are overwhelmingly good. In media, in journalism, the taking out of mediation is partly good. There's a lot of stuff we can get more quickly, and there are a lot more inputs into those channels and flows, which are useful. But taking out editing because we don't know how to price for it leads to serious declines in quality. And so I'm partly using Twitter because I want to understand where the world is headed in this space. And I kind of like the idea of being able to follow, 600 or 700 people that functionally become the editors and the news aggregators for me.
Right, it's your news feed.
I use it as my news feed.
But you
right?
also produce on Twitter.
But I produce on Twitter just because I believe in humor. I believe in laughing. I believe in friends who do gallows humor together. And I got a bunch of buddies from college and a couple of other stops in my life that my Twitter feed is like 85% for like 8 friends of mine. It's just public facing email. And the kinds of things we joke about are the fact that those of us who hunt and fish, we love wildlife, we love camping, we love being outside. But I am still stunned 3 times a week by the fact that the animals that live at or around my house, notice that distinction, we actually have 3 dogs and then there are a whole bunch of other animals we live out in the country that kind of are around our house and my kids kind of feed, but I don't think we really own these things. The big debate at our house is whether you cross the moral threshold of allowing your kids to name animals, because if you do, you just made them weak.
Right, that's a pet.
But those things, those pets and pet-ish relationships that we have in our life, they really think it's important to bring me carcasses. And I'm always surprised
Maybe
when I
they're
go out in
fans
the
of your
morning.
Twitter feed.
I know. Maybe they're groveling for attention. They want to see a post.
They want to be internet famous.
We get a lot of dead animals on our stoop and on our porch, and I'm still just a 12-year-old kid at heart when I see another dead animal delivered to me as a gift by another dead animal, and I got to tell my buddies, and it happens to be overseen by a larger Twitter world.
In the meantime, in the midst of all of this, you as you said, that you think the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both are intellectually exhausted. What does the Republican Party stand for at this point anymore?
I don't know.
Isn't that a problem?
Big
Is there
problem.
anybody who is addressing that, you feel like, in a real way?
I think that this city is consumed by people whose biggest long-term thought or whose longest-term thought is usually just their own reelection. And so we should applaud the founders for having seen the wisdom of having some 6-year terms around here, because imagine if everybody's thought cycles were only 2-year terms. I think we have generational crises and generational challenges in front of us. A lot of them are opportunity filled. I do think the new digital economy will yield more total global output than anything the world has ever imagined before. That's interesting, but I'm not at all sure that it will redound to the median household or the median worker. I'm worried about that. I think the Republican Party is absolutely nuts to regularly be seeding the field of concern about income inequality and about sort of flat to declining median American household wages to the Democratic Party. Now, we should argue about what the policy solutions are that will actually make a difference, but there are big challenges there. Where in Washington is anybody talking about the challenges of economic disruption and machine learning and artificial intelligence 10 years in the future? Bill Gates is thinking a lot about the challenges of what automation will do. He and I would differ and do differ on a whole bunch of the policy interventions that Washington should pursue. But his robot tax idea is something that we should be debating. We should be having conversations about that. We need a national security strategy for the age of cyber and jihad. When you're in the SCIF, when you're in the classified bunker getting briefings, as I do most days, I spend a lot of time on national security issues, and I ask spies and senior generals at the Pentagon, what are you losing sleep about? What do you believe 10 years from now we'll look back on this moment and regret that we underinvested in? Nobody takes a breath before they say cyber. We're completely unprepared for the pace of change that's coming as cyber disrupts warfare and frankly grays up the distinction.
Do you have any doubt about the Russia stuff that they were out to do all the things that the intelligence community has publicly said that they were out to do?
Oh, absolutely. Russia was trying to influence our election. Now,
were they succeeding?
Some of the ways that we talk about that tend to start with an assumption that their main goals were having one candidate defeat another candidate. That was not Russia's main goal.
Chaos.
Russia's main goal is chaos and American doubt of other Americans. And if you can do that, if they can sow those seeds of internal distrust, if they can drive down at that big fractured cleavage of distrust that we have in American life of most of our civic and governing institutions, then it makes it much harder for us to have a shared understanding of America's mission in the world. And what Russia really wants most of all is to fracture NATO. And so they advance that goal by sowing seeds of distrust regardless of who wins an election. I care a lot about 2016, and we need to do the full, complete investigation into exactly how that played out and who they were trying to influence in that organization and campaign. But the bigger point is we need to be looking to 2018 and 2020 for what comes next, because they're going to fuzzy up the distinction between military and civilian targets. And we don't have any of the right mental frameworks for how to debate this yet.
And it's funny, I did an article the other day that was about this hacker conference in July that's going to try to hack voting machines. And they said they're going to spend 3 days doing it. The Russians probably spending years doing it, preparing for what's next. Obama's thought about his post-presidency and inspiring young people to get more involved is that the beneath the surface part of it is that he feels like if more people are involved and more people are educated about what's happening, that's better for Democrats, that his politics will win out. I assume that you don't agree with that.
Yeah, I don't. I think that the president, President Obama comes from a frame of reference that usually assumes that politics are the center of everything. I don't believe that. That's a normative debate. But as a descriptive debate, I also don't think most American people want politicization of more.
If more people are engaged, you think that will lead to more people being conservative?
Well, I think that what I care about first is that people are good moms
engaged.
And dads and neighbors, right? So engagement isn't just primarily political engagement. But then once you are engaged, once you don't feel like you're marginalized from the normal things that happen in the public square, which again are the local Rotary Club and the Little League and the PTA. It's not primarily the organizing of political parties that's the main thing most people want to spend their time on. But then once you are civically engaged, then I think you have a prudential, measured kind of political engagement, what Eisenhower called the obligation of every American citizen to be a part-time politician. We shouldn't have this city populated by permanent career, lifetime incumbency-seeking politicians, but we also shouldn't have the American people checking out entirely. And once you do that, which is I do think that elite media consumers, a lot of the folks that are in conversations you and I are having yesterday or today, or people listening to this podcast, elite media consumers are increasingly politically polarized. But then we tend to project that onto everyone else. The vast majority of the American people are not politically polarized. They're politically increasingly disengaged. And then they're left with a binary choice. And they don't like the binary choice. I mean, that's the thing we're still not reflecting on sufficiently in a town like this from the last cycle. The American people overwhelmingly disapproved of both candidates. And those who voted mostly voted against one candidate more than for one candidate. We should not have a politics that's about the lesser of two evils. We should have a politics that's about the competition of two sets of policy futures.
Just two?
That want, or more, that want to outcompete each other. We should have a lot of people running on 70% issues.
I want to ask you two more quick questions and then play a quick game before we're done.
Wait, don't tell me.
No, you did that already. We'll but in part inspired by your performance on it, maybe. One of your colleagues in the Senate tweeted just before we started, this is Brian Schatz, senator from Hawaii, who you're friendly with, right?
I like Brian a lot, yeah. And his politics are crazy. But
yeah,
I like
they do not agree with your politics, shockingly for a Democrat from Hawaii. We must welcome conservatives into a temporary alliance to save the country. Many true conservatives are disgusted and embarrassed. Are you?
Tell me more precisely. Disgusted and embarrassed, because I'm disgusted and embarrassed by lots of things, but let's get particular.
All I've got is his tweet. It seems like he is maybe responding to the incident with the reporter being attacked in Montana and larger things that are going on. He obviously is very opposed to what President Trump is doing. And it seems like a cultural thing that he's picking up on, not just I don't like the president's position on X, Y, or Z.
Well, I mean, we just only touched in passing on the Montana reports overnight, and so I don't know all the particulars, but if you're seeking a job as a public servant, if you're going to serve in the Congress, one of the core obligations before you is to teach American civics. And if you're teaching American civics, you celebrate a First Amendment of free press, speech, assembly, and religion. And if the First Amendment means anything, it means you don't body slam a reporter. It means that regardless of whether or not you think in a given situation reporter X, Y, and Z in town hall A, B, or C is annoying, you pause and you celebrate the First Amendment. And so there's a lot there that this city is filled with people who want to get down to Hatfields and McCoy's shirts and skins blood feud of who did what to whom 3 years ago in what policy debate. Before all those policy debates, we need to pause, pull up, affirm what America means. It's about universal human dignity. It's about limited government. It's about checks and balances. It's about people's rights that predate government. And it's about affirming that First Amendment. And we should all be able – Brian's right if that's what the tweet means. He's right that we should be celebrating that before we argue about
and not
X
just
or Y
about
policy.
the report, but a cultural thing that's happened, which obviously is of concern to you. You may be diagnosing things differently, but you're not the only two people who are somewhat upset about where things are at the moment.
Yeah, no, we're not debating the big issues in the country. This city is not focused on the right things.
The other question before we go to the game would be coming back on something that you said that you would be ready to come back to. Is Donald Trump an adult by your definition of it? When I was reading, listing off to you the things that were done to accommodate him by foreign leaders, you kind of closed your eyes and smiled. So do you think that he stands for the kind of American adulthood that you want?
I'll repeat this, and then I'll get to what I think an adult should look like. The Vanishing American Adult is very truly not about politics. The president is never mentioned in the book, and with the exception of flagging some debates we should have in education reform and in future job retraining, The Vanishing American Adult isn't even about policy. The Vanishing American Adult is about habits, and the kinds of habits that American adults need to have are celebrating the dignity of individual workers. Everybody's work that benefits their neighbor is important. There are not more and less important people. There are different callings that people have at different moments in life. Limiting your consumption is a way of distinguishing not just production versus consumption, but needs versus wants. And limitless appetites, the yearnings of what a material culture can create in us, don't ultimately produce happiness. What produces happiness is meaningful service to your neighbor. What produces happiness is celebrating having basic needs met, not extravagant public consumption. What travel produces, again, living in a different neighborhood, serving different communities, traveling into literature, traveling into books, being a reader, being dispassionate and deliberate, doing the hard work of traveling to other cultures, again, in literature, but also in time and space, and traveling across generations. That kind of travel produces empathy. And what we want American adults to look like are people who can love their neighbor. And there's a kind of humility about that I think is obvious when you see it.
It feels like this book tour would be easier for you if people didn't keep asking about Donald Trump.
I'm not going to argue with that.
All right, let's do a little word association. You're quick on your feet. You do a lot of quick jokes on Twitter. You were on Wait, Don't Tell Me. So just give me one word for each of these. Let's start with President Trump. Word that comes to mind.
I don't know that you can do these kind in one word, but current president.
Chuck Schumer.
Smoking reefer.
That's referring to your own Twitter feed. It's a commercial for your Twitter feed here.
At Ben Sasse has some good pictures of Chuck with mad professor hair, and what Darth and other people on the internet created, they're things of beauty. I wouldn't have wanted to live in the pre-Twitter era before someone could immediately Photoshop a sort of beer can sized joint into Schumer's fingers.
Those originals did not need much work, though. Paul Ryan.
He's got a hard calling. It's we don't have policy. I can't do it in one word, but we don't have any policy consensus in the country right now. And so the speaker, living in the populist body, the people's body, he has an incredibly tough job.
Yeah, let's try to do one word. Come on, Republican Party.
Question mark.
The Democratic Party.
Fighting 1960s battles.
Nancy Pelosi.
I don't know her. I mean, she said stuff about Gorsuch that's so breathtakingly stupid that I don't even know where to begin. Before she knew anything about the guy who's going to be a great Supreme Court justice, she warned America's children to start buying bottled water because they're going to die because a guy who believes in a constitution where judges don't get to be super legislators is going to be on the court. So, of course, he's secretly sneaking around in the pipes of their house injecting poison.
That's not what was happening in your mind?
I haven't seen the video. I mean, who am I to question it? It's just probably an open journalistic theory, and we should ask big
it's on the
broad
internet
questions.
Somewhere, right? Ted Cruz.
A really, really smart guy. Ted and I vote similarly in a lot of topics. He has been focused on politics for a really long time, and that's not been my experience.
Mitch McConnell.
Has another really hard job. I mean, that's a guy, a leader that my view of his job has changed a lot in the 29 months I've been here. Because he and I differ on what I thought was a normative fight, and I think he thought as a descriptive fight about the relationships between Article 1 and Article 2. I want policy initiation to come from the legislature because boards versus executives in my corporate life and in my not-for-profit strategy intervention life, I know we're boards deliberate well, executives act well, and you need to distinguish between those functions. And so I want the legislature to be the place where policy deliberation happens in America. I think Mitch knows something that I didn't understand before I got here, which is there's so much fragmented attention in America that you really need the executive to use the bully pulpit to initiate a big policy discussion. And so I think the leader has a very, very hard job.
Let's just do a couple more. Reince Priebus.
I, as a sort of strategy project, gave a little bit of advice. Mitt Romney asked me for advice in the summer of 2012 on how to organize his White House. And so I went and interviewed every living chief of staff who'd ever served at the White House. And there's a continuum from people who think the chief of staff's job is 100% process management and 0% advocacy to the other extreme, which believes it's 99% process management and 1% advocacy. The job is to get the right people in the room to make every decision, which is sometimes the president's the toughest job you could possibly have. And you need to have every decision refined for you by the time it comes to you. And so sometimes you need 3 people in the room to make a decision. Sometimes you need 7. Sometimes you need 13. But if you need 7, you better not have 13 and you better not have 3. And it's the chief of staff's job to build a decision-making process.
So what's the one word there to describe where he is now? Maybe?
I think they're all still learning.
Jared Kushner?
The most powerful member of a presidential family ever.
Ivanka Trump.
It's a weird structure.
What about Ivanka Trump?
Jared's wife. I don't know. They're
she's more than Jared's wife, right?
Yeah, she is. But I mean, they both have a role in the White House that is very strange in the American system. I know we're at time here.
Tax reform, infrastructure. Give me one on each of those.
I mean, we're not going to get through your list. We should be doing infrastructure. We should just pay for it.
Yeah. All right. Last 3 here. One word for each of these. 2018.
That's next year. I'm thinking about the Huskers football schedule.
2020.
My kids will be one will just graduated high school. One will be pushing her junior year, and my son will hopefully be playing his first tackle football game.
All right, so I'm going to give you the last one. Ben Sasse.
trying to be a good dad and husband and trying to do American civics.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking the time.